crafting is a really fun mechanic. There's something special about a piece of gear that you have made yourself, but don't be fooled by the amazing crafted items you might have seen online that eclipse even the most powerful uniques. Those are extremely rare to get. Most of your crafted items will be looking closer to something like this. Absolute garbage. You are basically creating a rare item with some predetermined stats, but for most of the crafting recipes, those stats aren't even any good. In addition, every crafting attempt calls for a specific item, a specific gem, a specific rune, and a jewel. And if you fail and want to try again, you need to collect another round of crafting supplies, and those don't grow on trees in Diablo 2. At best, crafting is a way of supplementing your other gear if you're chasing for some very specific stat. You really can't rely on crafting alone to— Hi, I'm Sorfen, and in this video I'm going to start a brand new character who is only allowed to wear equipment that he has crafted himself, and that ended up being a lot worse than I thought. I picked the Barbarian for this challenge. That might be the worst choice I could make, but it's also the perfect choice. You see, I had been looking forward to this challenge for a long time, and I wanted to pick the most gear dependent class, so that every crafted item would really matter. The Barbarian doesn't have any summons, damage dealing auras or fireballs to rely on. I just couldn't pick any other character. I named our new hero Qbert to really seal his fate. And speaking of fate, I decided to do this challenge in hardcore, which means that death is permanent. If I die in this challenge, not only is my character lost, but all his hard-earned gear and all crafting supplies will be gone forever. I arrived at the Rogue Encampment, a charming little settlement with friendly inhabitants and a serious demon problem. I offered to help the locals, but first I had to get rid of my starting axe and shield, because I had no memory of crafting those. I stepped out into the Bloodmoor, ready to start my journey from random passerby to hero, but there was an immediate problem. I was completely gearless, and to unlock crafting I had to make it into the desert of the second act and find the Horadric Cube. But to get to that point I would have to fight hordes of foul demons and beasts.
Beware foul demons and beasts.
And all I had to work with were my bare fists, which despite my impressive muscular physique only dealt 1 to 2 damage. Though the Bloodmoor wasn't very challenging even under these conditions, I focused on clearing out every lost enemy to gain as much experience as possible, because with no gear to rely on, getting more levels was one of the few ways for me to get stronger. I put my stat points into vitality for a bigger life pool and my skill points into bash, which doubled my punch damage. Of course, doubling in this context wasn't that impressive, but I happily accepted any boost I could get. I was not used to playing on hardcore mode, so already in the Den of Evil the tension increased when I encountered my first elite monster, Corpsefire. Things got a little dicey when its spectral hit attack first slowed me with cold damage and a few slaps from his crew dropped me below half life. But the bash skill came in really handy here, as it not only adds damage to your attacks but also knocks the target away from you, and when enemies are knocked back they can't attack you. I guess I wasn't really that close to dying here, but just the knowledge that death was permanent was already constantly on my mind. Playing hardcore is going to be really intense, isn't it? I turned in the first quest, which earned Akara's trust. That was nice and all, but I cared mostly about the extra skill point that came with it. I then continued punching my way through the cold plains and the stony field. As long as I was careful to not get overrun, I could manage my way through the early parts of the game despite my lack of gear. One benefit of the Barbarian is that he gains a lot of extra life each level, especially if you put your stat points into vitality. So despite my lack of armor, my life pool could handle a decent bit of abuse. And it was lucky that it did, because in the stony field I tried taking on a nasty pack of elite archers, and to the surprise of no one, bringing finger guns to a shootout was not a good idea. I had to take my time and approach every elite enemy carefully, separating them into smaller groups if possible and making sure I had an escape route if things got too hot. And of course, constantly drinking health potions. Now I'm no stranger to playing like this. Many challenge runs I've done have called for tactical and grindy battles, but usually not in Act 1 of normal difficulty. It was clear to me that I would not be able to rush my way through Act 1 in pursuit of unlocking crafting quickly. I had to take my time and get some levels and any other advantage I could get. For the next hour or so I carefully worked my way through the act, using the narrow terrain in the underground passage to my advantage, using view-blocking trees in the dark wood to my disadvantage, and then through the Black Marsh. My normal attack's base damage did not improve with additional levels at all, so I kept pumping points into bash to make up for my lack of damage. Or, well, that was the idea anyway, but I found a pretty serious bug with bash. The thing that made the skill so appealing was that it adds flat extra damage, and you can clearly see why I thought so on my character screen. My level 5 bash was supposed to deal 7 to 9 damage per swing, but while progressing through the act I found it to be really weak. It just didn't feel like I was doing that kind of damage. So I returned to the Bloodmoor for some testing. According to my research, my bash should always kill Bloodmoor zombies in 1 to 2 hits max, but it consistently took more than that. Something was wrong. Confused but curious, I grabbed a high-level Barbarian and went to the same area with a low-damaging dagger to see if it had something to do with Qbert being unarmed, but even with a completely maxed bash, showing me 22 to 31 damage, I still needed 2 bashes to take down a Bloodmore zombie, who can spawn with 12 life at most. Yikes. I went to do some research online, and while bash isn't the most discussed skill, I eventually managed to confirm my suspicion. The +2 damage on bash was in fact broken. The character screen had been lying to me the entire time. This was a huge setback. Bash was supposed to be a substitute for a mighty axe, not a slightly enhanced punch. I had been counting on this to carry me until I could start crafting, but now it seemed like a broken crutch to lean on. But luckily for me, shortly after this discovery I hit level 8, and that meant that another way of increasing my power had just unlocked. I could now pay a small sum of gold to hire a rogue mercenary. They are usually locked behind a quest that I didn't feel like doing gearless, but after hitting level 8 you can just hire them anyway and ignore the quest. She was under the same crafted only gear restrictions as I was, but even without any gear her basic attack was a lot stronger than mine, and on top of that her skills were actually working as advertised. Let's not question how an unarmed archer was clearly shooting arrows with a bow, because I really needed a bit of help here. With bash not looking so appealing anymore, I started to invest my skill points elsewhere. I put points into the Warcry Howl, which causes nearby monsters to run away in fear, as well as Taunt, which does the opposite, causing monsters to walk towards you. Those skills were not only great tools for crowd control when combined, but Howl also was a great panic button in case I got swarmed and had to run away. The Barbarian is also a master in various fighting styles, with a skill tree dedicated to different weapon masteries, but there is no skill called Fist Mastery, so I left this skill tree empty until I crafted my first weapon. We entered the monastery where the final stretch towards Andariel began, and every fight was now a grind. I had assumed more of a supporting role for my mercenary now, instead of the fierce warrior I dreamt of becoming. When entering the barracks, the environment shifted to an indoor setting. This allowed for some opportunistic use of choke points, and doors became my new favorite thing. The trade-off was that the mercenary would sometimes walk into a room and get stuck, or position herself behind an obstacle so she couldn't shoot at monsters in battle. I was starting to understand how the Sisterhood lost the monastery to the demon invasion. But even though we were able to push through, there was a problem. If we were barely able to fight even regular monsters, how was I ever to defeat Andariel? I didn't think I could rely on my mercenary for that fight, since Andariel deals double damage to mercenaries and has a strong AoE attack. And with bash not working properly, I had to find another way of powering up my Barbarian. I was not going to take on Andariel in hardcore with nothing but punches dealing 1 to 2 damage per swing. My plan had 2 parts, levels and charms. I decided to allow myself to use any charms in my inventory for this challenge, and my reasoning was twofold. First, you can't craft charms, so it was either this or no charms at all. And finally, I could really use some buffs. Right now to have any additional stats at all, and later to help shore up some of the holes that my crafted gear would leave me with. And you know, charms are just sitting in your inventory and not equipped in a gear slot, so I think that slides. For levels, I abused the terrain in the jail. By dragging monsters to a cell and then hiding myself and my mercenary behind the bars, she could shoot elite packs down behind the safety of a closed door. This was slow, but it was safe, a trade-off I was happy to make with a gearless hardcore character any day. But I didn't stick with this for very long, because other than bash, none of my other available skills would really do that much for me damage-wise. Then for charms, I increased the player setting of the game, which brings harder monsters and more loot and experience, but instead of fighting for my loot, I ran around and opened chests and lootable terrain. This grind is just a footnote in this edited video of the challenge, but this preparation for Andariel took hours. I was livestreaming this challenge, and during this part I spent over an hour looting the same house in the stony field, over and over and over. When you say it out loud like that, it doesn't sound like thrilling live entertainment, but I sure appreciated the company, so here's a little shout out to the live viewers who joined me on the many long and tedious grinds for this challenge. I found a few decent early game charms, but they were mostly defensive, and what I was really looking for was some elemental damage. I also found some crafting materials, which was not going to help me in Act 1, but it was nice to have for the future. Eventually I did find what I was asking for. This really beefed up my damage per punch on my character screen, but it was not as good as it first seemed. You see, Andariel, who I was preparing for, has a really high poison resistance in normal, a massive 80%. And then there's the thing that poison damage is dealt over time, and you can't stack poison instances on the same monster in Diablo 2. So in the end that wasn't that big of an improvement to my damage, but it was still an improvement, and I gladly took any improvement I could get. Despite my grind only elevating me to slightly above gearless, I decided to move on and give Andariel a try anyway. I had spent so much time already in a challenge about crafting gear, and I hadn't even unlocked crafting yet. I didn't feel too confident in the boss fight, but with my big life pool I at least felt confident that I would have a chance to escape if things didn't work out, and the poison damage charm was a noticeable improvement while fighting normal monsters on my way down the catacombs. I reached level 4, and since this challenge is all about gear, let's do a quick gear check before the boss fight. I was only level 11, with a small collection of charms, my mercenary and a couple of fists. I loaded up on antidotes and health potions, and after successfully pulling Andariel away from the other enemies, the arguably most important fight for this character was on. And I was standing up to her surprisingly well, and I even dared to straight up face tank her for short periods of time before running away, giving my mercenary the opportunity to land a few well placed fire arrows. Once she got in Andariel's way though, she fell quickly, just as expected, but I have to say that this fight was not at all as bad as I was expecting. Several trips back to town to restock on potions and resurrect my mercenary later, Andariel was down to a sliver of HP. This fight took over 10 minutes from start to finish, which really is a long time for the first boss of the game, but I was just happy that we somehow made it through it all. And finally, we defeated Andariel, my ticket to Act 2. The gear that she dropped was of course not useful to me, as will be a theme for boss loot in this challenge, but she always drops a normal gem on the quest kill. Unfortunately, she gave me a skull, and that's one of the few gems you can't actually craft anything with. With the first act completed in my underwear, I had passed the first major danger for this hardcore character, so before moving on I decided to invest a little more time in farming in Act 1, mainly for more levels up to level 16 to increase my odds of surviving getting the cube, and for some more materials in preparation for crafting. But enough about Act 1, let's move on to Act 2, where this challenge really began. So finally I'd reached Act 2, the promised land of the Horadric Cube. I was ready to start my career as a DIY blacksmith, but there was still a slight issue. The cube isn't just handed out to anyone who enters Lut Gholein. You have to go out into the desert and down into a tomb and grab it as part of a quest. And of course, it's heavily guarded by all kinds of monsters. I was determined to go straight for it, and the key to grabbing the cube as quickly as possible was to just run away from all enemies, hoping they wouldn't catch up to me. My investment in Howl really shined here, as I could scare away any non-elite monsters that swarmed me, and before long, there it was, the core component to this challenge and the key to leaving my gearless days behind, the Horadric Cube. I quickly snatched it and went back to town, and let me make a clarification about the rules for this challenge. When I say crafting only, I do not mean any item made with the Horadric Cube, I mean only items that are created by what is referred to as crafting recipes, with orange item names. And I guess now is a good time to dig a little deeper into how crafting works in Diablo 2. If you're not interested in the mechanics behind it and just want the short version, then sorry, this is mandatory material. Welcome to Crafting 101. There are 36 crafting recipes in total, divided into 4 families or themes. Blood, which makes items with life and life-related stats. Caster, which as the name suggests is crafting for casters. Safety, which guarantees some damage mitigation. And then finally Hit Power, which I don't even know what the theme really is, because it always gives a chance to cast Frost Nova when hit and some attacker takes damage as fixed stats. As I mentioned in the intro of the video, every crafted item requires a specific magic item, a specific rune, a specific perfect gem and any jewel. The result is a crafted item with an orange name, with a few guaranteed stats depending on the recipe you used, and then between 1 to 4 random stats on top. For example, I decided to craft a blood weapon first, and for that I needed a magic axe. The stats on the axe doesn't matter because they aren't retained after crafting, but the item type is, so I chose a big two-handed axe to ensure I got at least decent damage. Well, any damage would be an upgrade compared to my fists, but with limited supplies I wanted as strong of a weapon as possible. Then I needed a perfect ruby, which I got from farming gem shrines in Act 1, a jewel, and then an ort rune, which I got from cubing 3 rare runes from the Countess. When I transmute this in the cube, it will create a new axe with these predetermined stats. 35 to 60% enhanced damage, 1 to 4% lifesteal, 10 to 20 life, and then between 1 to 4 random stats in addition to that. And there really is a big difference in the predetermined stats that the different recipes get. If you compare the blood axe to for example a caster weapon, it would only get mana and mana regen as guaranteed rolls. And not only was that not the right stats for my Barbarian, but even if you're a spellcaster, just getting a little bit of mana and some mana regen are very lackluster for your weapon. This means that I have 2 important choices to make with each craft. What base item am I looking for, and which crafting recipe has the most interesting guaranteed stats for my character. And of course, to a lesser extent, it will also depend on what kind of crafting materials I have available to me. I guess I'll also mention that because there's only 4 weapon crafting recipes, I will be kind of limited in what kind of weapons I can use. For example, you can't craft swords or bows at all, there just isn't a crafting recipe that uses them. Now about those random stats, without going too deep into it, because how the game generates random stats is a bit complex. The basics are that the higher your character's level in combination with the level of the item you use as input, which is a hidden stat not visible in game by the way, the better your chances of getting more random stats on your crafts, as well as the possibility for higher level stats, like higher damage numbers. This is a simplified explanation, but for the sake of the video I think all you need to know is that on average I will get better items the higher my level is, and I should avoid using items I found in really low level areas when crafting. But I want to highlight that higher level items will be better on average, but not guaranteed. Because while higher levels unlocks the potential of higher level stats, you can still get awful random stats at any point. That's just the way randomly generated items are in Diablo 2. And one final thing about the level requirements of items. The final level requirement of a magic or rare item is based on the stat which has the highest level requirement, or the level requirement of the base item itself if that is higher. But when you are crafting, that final level requirement is then further increased for every random stat you get. And this will end up mattering a lot in this challenge. So, with all of that taken care of, let's see what my first crafted item ended up being, and I was very excited in the moment to finally put a weapon in my hands. Alright, nice looking axe. We can see the enhanced damage, lifesteal and life from the crafting recipe, and then mana steal and a little bit of poison damage as randomly generated stats. But there are actually 3 random stats on this item. If we look closer, the enhanced damage rolled 85, which is higher than the max for the recipe roll, so there is actually another small enhanced damage stat on top of the guaranteed one. And here's that thing about the level requirement I was talking about before. A really strong axe for this early in the game, but because of the added level requirement from crafting, I was a whole 9 levels away from equipping it. In this case it would have been better for me if I only rolled one of those random stats, because then I would have been able to use it sooner, but that's just the way it's gonna be for this challenge. I was close to being able to craft another item, but I needed one more jewel, and this character ended up being pretty unlucky with jewels, which ended up being the bottleneck for my crafting throughout most of the challenge. I was disappointed about the axe and considered going back to Act 1 and open chests again until another jewel dropped for one more craft. But thinking about it, at this low level it was likely that crafts would have a too high level requirement anyway, so I decided to try and push on instead and hope to find another jewel along the way. My gearless days weren't over yet, but I still achieved a couple of improvements in Act 2 to help speed up my way to get there. I hired a new mercenary, Galsar, who had even better weaponless damage than my rogue mercenary, and also a passive healing aura, and together we brawled our way through the act. And to be honest, I was surprised how well we were doing in Act 2, without a single piece of equipment between the two of us. I reached level 18 and unlocked Leap Attack. I had not used this skill for a very long time, and this has been given a significant upgrade since last time I tried it. It now deals a bit of damage in an area around you when you land, in addition to the big single target hit it always had. And that area damage does not depend on your weapon, only on the level of the skill, meaning this was an opportunity for me to start dealing some damage. I had no plan for my long-term build yet, but Leap Attack seemed like a great place to start, and I could always respec later. We slowly fought our way through most of Act 2 before that second jewel dropped, but eventually it dropped from a ghost in the Arcane Sanctuary, while I was admiring Galsar's big damage numbers. My second attempt at crafting a usable piece of gear, and since my only perfect gem was a sapphire, I decided to try crafting a hit power weapon, requiring a gem, a jewel, a terrun, and a blunt weapon, like a mace or a hammer. This was gonna get up to 60% enhanced damage just like the blood weapon, but then some damage reflection and a chance to cause Frost Nova when hit. Not amazing weapon stats at first glance, but the Frost Nova trigger is actually pretty decent early game crowd control. Again, I went with the biggest two-handed option I could get, hungry for maximum damage. And again, it turned into a very decent weapon, but with too high of a level requirement, though 22 was lower than the 25 on the axe at least. At this point I was almost at the second act boss burial, but I didn't want to find another act boss in my underwear, so I decided to farm some tomb areas until I reached level 22 and could equip the hammer. I had a pretty close call here when leaping too deep into a pack of enemies, and losing this character now would be so painful. A reminder to play more carefully. I did find another jewel during this grind, and after another round of gem shrine hunting I was now ready for my third craft. I considered doing yet another weapon craft, but since I already decided to grind to 22 for them all, I decided to craft a belt instead. That wouldn't have as big potential, but having more potion slots would be so convenient, because I was drinking a lot of potions with this character, and having only 4 in my quick slots was getting really tedious already. And the belt was okay, not great but perfectly decent for this early into the game, the Frost Nova triggers from the hit power recipe being the main reason I chose this over the other options, and that proved to be just as useful as I was hoping for. But let's be honest, the most significant thing was that it was a piece of gear that I could actually equip. I would have been happy with any roll. After almost 2 full acts with no gear on and several hours of playtime, my crafting only character finally had some crafted equipment on him. Then after finding a Crush Flange unique mace in the tombs, a subtle middle finger from the game, I finally hit level 22. This prompted a respec because I did not have the required strength, but I did not want to wait any longer on my maul. Skill wise I stuck with leap attack for now, put a point here and there for prerequisites and passives, and then saved the rest in anticipation of hitting level 24 and unlocking battle orders. And just look at that damage increase, triple digit damage. I was starting to think that such numbers were impossible. While respecing I also identified a big potential problem, low attack rating, but since this was hardcore I didn't feel like I could spare any points into dexterity at the time, and any stat point that I didn't need in strength to wear the maul went into vitality for more life. I was now better equipped than ever before and moved on to Duriel, being level 22, which is on the high end for Act 2, and with a big heavy hammer, Duriel took an absolute beating. I leapt over him a few times and delivered heavy blows when I landed, and I defeated him in less than a minute. What a complete makeover for this Barbarian. Who would have thought that a weapon could make such a difference? Presumably everyone, but that didn't mean it felt any less amazing to experience. After a bit of a slow start, after an extremely slow start to the challenge, now things were really picking up. With the good area damage and great single target damage of leap attack, I was now clearing my way through the game with ease, relatively speaking. With the Barbarian's small mana pool against the hefty mana cost of leap attack, I was considering if maybe my next item should be a castercraft, but I was once again lacking the necessary jewel, and since the mana problem was really more of a mana inconvenience, I decided to push on rather than try to farm for one. Within an hour I reached the next act boss Mephisto. I was really struggling to hit him with my main attack, mostly tickling him with the smaller area damage of leap attack. But when the main attack did hit, it dealt really significant damage. And with my big life pool now boosted even further by battle orders, I wasn't in any real danger despite having no resistance gear at all. And in convincing fashion I took down another act boss. I felt really strong at the time, and I kind of was, but the question was of course how long could I push on with only a maul and a belt. My damage kept being more than good enough in Act 4 as well. Enemies dealt noticeably more damage to me now compared to the previous act, and since I was still getting used to hardcore it felt really intense, and I got scared as soon as my life pool dropped below half, even though I didn't have any truly close calls. Luckily leap attack was not only good on offense, it was also a nice escape mechanism in case I walked into dangerous situations. Though the Chaos Sanctuary in Diablo is a big step up in difficulty compared to what comes before, so before taking that on I wanted to craft at least another item, but in all of Act 3 and half of Act 4 I had not seen a single jewel drop. So before going into the Chaos Sanctuary I went back to Act 3 and Lower Kurast. This area has several special chests that can drop a lot of items at once, a really good farming spot for crafting materials, even if opening chests over and over wasn't the most exciting gameplay. They are also a good source of charms, and while I hadn't found any truly great charms, the small bonuses from each added up. For example, I had found several charms with fire resistance, which was going to be very helpful against Diablo. When I reached level 25 I decided to try my crafted axe out while farming. I think it looked cooler on my Barbarian and it did have a little bit of mana still, which was nice, but there was a significant drop in damage. So I used it for fun for a while, but the maul was definitely a better weapon. After a fair bit of grinding, that elusive jewel finally dropped. And Diablo 2 being Diablo 2, it didn't drop from one of the super chests that I was targeting, but from a random piece of lootable terrain that I clicked on a whim. And then after a few more gem shrines to make a perfect amethyst, it was time to craft my next item, a caster helm. I think that so far I had actually been pretty lucky with my craft rolls, definitely above average I would say. But of course the pendulum of luck swings back and forth, and this helm was looking really poor. 1% mana steal, 13 mana and 10% mana regen as the caster rolls, and then only a single random stat on top. It was a bit disappointing, but any new piece of gear on an empty gear slot was objectively a big upgrade, and with another roll I was really starting to stack those Frost Nova triggers. The Chaos Sanctuary was the most dangerous area yet, with curses and lots of scary enemies. The choice to stick with leap attack proved to be a great one, as it allowed me to snipe the Oblivion Knights reliably, and then against the rest I jumped in and out of combat to minimize time spent taking damage, as well as dealing decent damage around me whenever I landed on my enemies. But then I was facing a big problem, Diablo himself. With my big life pool and my fire resistance charms, his fire spells ended up being not too scary, but his lightning attack on the other hand, that had a real chance of killing me and ending the run. It deals 50% physical and 50% lightning damage, and lots of it too. And I only had 9 lightning resistance and no physical damage reduction, so there was no doubt in my mind that he would kill me in one beam if I let him. And he got really close to doing so a few times, even though me jumping over him made only a small part of the beam actually hit me. This was really scary. I had a second close call and then a third one, with spamming potions being the only thing that saved me. I had an idea to make it safer and I lured Diablo out of the middle to create more space, and then I started leaping at him from a distance whenever I saw an opening, as opposed to just going for as many attacks as quickly as possible. I still got hit for big damage whenever he timed his lightning attack well, but by timing my attacks to when he had just finished a beam, I could avoid most of it. And that way I did eventually beat Diablo, but that was one stressful fight. This challenge had been super grindy so far and very intense against hard enemies, but it turned out that Diablo was by far the hardest challenge of normal difficulty, and defeating him marked the start of a new chapter for this character. By doing some level grinding at the start of Act 5, my leap attack was getting so strong that it completely carried me for a while, even though I didn't see any gear upgrades. Leap attack's effectiveness would fade out eventually, as it doesn't really scale too well into later difficulties, but for the time being I enjoyed the spike in power. And the extra area damage from this skill was really nice to have, both for farming and for progressing through the act, and I defeated Act 5 without too much trouble, a big contrast to Act 4. Without any new gear I took out all of the ancients on the first try. I guess I haven't talked about my mercenary for a while, but I was currently using a cold iron wolf from Act 3 for some extra crowd control from his cold spells. I wasn't giving my mercenary too much attention though, since any of them had trouble staying alive with no gear and me just leaping around all the time, leaving them stranded and surrounded by enemies, though they will play a bigger role later once I can get some gear for one. And then shortly after that, Bale fell to my leap attack as well. I beat normal at level 33 and my character was surprisingly strong at this point. I've already talked about the greatness of leap attack and its level scaling area damage, but my defensive stats were pretty decent as well, getting a big boost from battle orders to increase my total life by a good percentage, and then the passive skill natural resistance increasing all of my resistances. You wouldn't be able to guess from these stats that I was barely wearing any equipment. Even though I was doing alright, I was determined to do another craft before moving into Nightmare. I had a good amount of low-level crafting runes and a decent amount of gems, but I was very short on jewels. So I looted Lower Kurast for one more and then decided to craft my first pair of boots. These were, unfortunately, some of the worst boots I have ever seen. All of the stats were technically improvements for my character, I guess, and the additional Frost Nova trigger was decent, but this was not at all what I was hoping for, and wouldn't be a noticeable improvement for my Barbarian at all. And this was something I would have to get used to. Going back into the intro, crafts are basically just rares with a few extra steps and some guaranteed stats. And in Diablo 2, far from every randomly generated item will be good. Actually, most of them will be trash. And here's a short livestream clip of me summarizing my gear, and I thought I captured how I felt about my current loadout well. We're still using the maul, the crafted maul, big damage but not very good stats. Alright stats, they are decent for what they are. The worst helm you have ever seen, but it does add some mana. A belt with the only redeeming quality that it increases my potion size, or like my potion slots. And then we ended by crafting this stinker last time. Not very impressive. Despite that, I didn't feel like it was necessary to grind for more jewels in normal, so I moved on to Nightmare and hoped to just find more as I quested. I was doing perfectly fine and took enemies down at a decent pace. I was getting myself into some iffy situations, causing me to drop really low, but that was mainly due to carelessness and talking to my live chat while playing, not so much the characters or the gear's fault. My next craft was going to be a pair of blood gloves, a craft with big potential thanks to the guaranteed crushing blow roll in addition to lifesteal and life. And in case you don't know, crushing blow gives a chance to deal a portion of enemy's current life as extra damage, which can result in big damage against tanky enemies like act bosses. And this turned into some really solid gloves. I was a little disappointed at the time because I was really hoping for some resistances, but getting attack speed, crushing blow and dual leech from a single piece of gear was great. With a level requirement of 43, I couldn't use them still for a while, but this was my best craft yet for sure. For some reason, I kept identifying rares and other loot that I couldn't even use. I guess that identifying them was technically the right call since the items will sell for more that way, but it led to some real feel-bad moments with great unusable items dropping for me while I was running around half naked, like this rare ring. With nearly 1000 life and lots of antidote potions, I beat Andariel without equipping any new gear for the first act of Nightmare, as I was still underleveled for the gloves. I did find one more jewel in Act 1, but I didn't craft with it right away, because I was really indecisive about what to craft next. On one hand, I wanted to fill out all my empty gear slots as soon as possible to feel properly geared, but on the other hand, crafting a bigger weapon or trying for another pair of boots to get some run speed was tempting. I made it through the second act quickly, and before I took on Duriel I was finally gonna put on some new gear again. First, I was now level 43, meaning I could equip my gloves. And I had also found yet another jewel in Act 2, meaning I could now craft 2 items at once, which at the time felt like such a big deal after scrambling from craft to craft so far. I decided to go for a safety body armor first, hoping for some good defensive stats and sockets in addition to the guaranteed half freeze duration and damage reduction stats. I didn't get the resistances, but I did get 2 sockets, a very solid crafted armor for my Barbarian, and I feel obligated to mention that my assessment of item quality is very skewed for this video, because this really is a pretty mediocre item in the grand scheme of things, but for my Barbarian at the time it felt like hitting the jackpot. And I put a rail rune and an ort rune in it to boost my fire and lightning resistances by 30 each. Then I crafted a blood ring, as blood crafts in general seem to offer the best stats for my hardcore Barbarian. That rolled very mediocre stats though, but the blood stats alone made it a good upgrade from nothing, and I didn't hate the extra mana at the time, as leap attack was quite mana hungry. And then I took on Duriel. My damage against groups of normal enemies was still very solid, but my single target damage against bosses was starting to fall behind. A big reason for that was my chance to hit being very low, with a lack of attack rating from my gear and not being that high level. But I was not dying after all, so I didn't mind the slow kill speed against bosses that much. The double craft from Duriel made me hungry for more, and I really wanted to fill out my gear slots before going into Act 3, so I farmed a few more crafting supplies in earlier areas to make that happen. I had 2 more jewels and 2 empty gear slots, so even though my weapon was really due for an upgrade, I decided to craft 1 ring and 1 amulet first. For the ring I went with a caster one, not at all my preferred recipe, but I was starting to run a little low on rubies for blood crafts, and I was too impatient to do more gem shrine hunting at the time. But this time the random stat rolls really came through, giving me 2 resistance rolls, which I was very happy about. Between my armor, this ring, the natural resistance skill and some charms, my resistances were now looking really solid for Nightmare, with the 2 most important ones even hitting the cap of 75. And then I crafted a safety amulet. My reasoning was that eventually I would have to stop leaping into the middle of enemies to survive hardcore, and possibly even use a shield. And if that came true, I could use the extra block chance from this crafted amulet. And this was another really solid craft, getting 25 lightning resistance and +1 to the Barbarian mastery skills on top of the safety rolls. The lightning resistance didn't do anything for me right away, as I was already at the cap, but going into hell difficulty later, my resistances were going to take another penalty, so it was a really good stat to get still. And of course, getting +1 skill tree boost to the character I was actually playing felt great. 2 really nice crafts, and of course a big milestone for my Barbarian, as he was now fully clothed for the first time. With boosted morale, I began making my way through the act, though in hindsight, I think I did a slight mistake about halfway through Nightmare. I really needed the experience for levels, but hungry for progress I used leap attack to jump over a lot of enemies. Progress was decently quick, but my lacking level progression would hurt me in the future, as my chance to hit enemies were getting worse and worse the later I got into Nightmare. But at the same time, with good survivability, it was doable. And since it seemed to work, I guess I had no reason to question my approach in the moment. Though I started to make this realization during the very grindy Isuel fight, and since leap attack attacks rather slowly, missing an attack was rather noticeable, but as I find Act 4 pretty bad for farming in general, I didn't change my plans right away. Though in the Chaos Sanctuary I started questioning the whole leap attack plan altogether. With 1300 life and solid resistances, I was still taking a lot of damage in fights, since I was leaping in and out of packs all the time, not dealing very much damage each time, and missing a lot. Enemies had plenty of time to deal damage to me. To be fair, getting cursed by the knight made things look even worse, but this being hardcore I kind of had to survive those situations too. I couldn't just chalk it up to curses being unfair and pretend that everything was fine. Usually I would probably have kept on pushing through to make it to Act 5 and then look at options to improve the situation, but I was so scared of losing my character, being an unseasoned hardcore player, so I retreated from the sanctuary and farmed some more crafting supplies. Act 4 was really slow progress. My weapon could really use an upgrade, but my mercenary was still completely gearless after all, so I prioritized gearing him up first. And with some gear on, I thought that maybe an Act 2 mercenary with the Holy Freeze Aura was going to provide better crowd control and supplemental damage than the Iron Wolf. Crafting a spear is weird, because the crafting recipe has no guaranteed enhanced damage roll at all, but instead enhanced defense. I guess that it fits the safety theme, but having a weapon crafting recipe without guaranteed damage just feels weird to me. And of course, it makes for some very underwhelming crafts. Though my first spear got a tiny bit of ED as a random roll, quite a mediocre weapon, but still a weapon, so my mercenary would surely be able to put that to good use. Then I crafted a Bloodhelm, which has great potential with the guaranteed lifesteal, life and deadly strike, which gives a chance to deal double physical damage with every attack. I had hoped for a higher lifesteal roll to better help him stay alive, but all in all a decent first helm for the mercenary. Then instead of making a body armor from a mercenary as my third and final craft, I decided to finally try for a bigger and better hammer for myself, using this exceptional level high damage two-handed bunker. And this ended up being a very good craft, getting a random enhanced damage roll on top of the guaranteed one for 122% enhanced damage in total. Not much else to note, but those were some good damage numbers, way eclipsing anything I had before. It did prompt me to use one of my precious respecs to get the necessary 169 strength to use it, but there was just no way I could resist such damage numbers, even though it meant sacrificing some of my life pool to make it happen, and the added damage was really significant, increasing my single target damage several times over. With my now semi-geared mercenary providing a distraction as well as an AoE slowing cold aura, together with my big new hammer, I tackled the Chaos Sanctuary once again and it was going a lot better this time, and I was able to clear the area out to summon Diablo without any really close calls. Diablo himself didn't call for any special tactics this time, I just jumped over him back and forth with leap attack until he fell.
Eternal suffering would be.
I then hurried through the final act of Nightmare as fast as possible, with the intent of doing a respec before tackling Hell, despite just having invested another one into leap attack to wear the new hammer. I had no idea what kind of build I wanted to go with for the last difficulty yet, but I was sure that leap attack was not going to be the way. It just felt too risky with the long and slow jumping animation, and it had happened several times now that I clicked on the wrong enemy by accident when using leap attack, resulting in me jumping straight into the middle of a big pack of elites rather than at the outskirts of the pack as intended. And going into Hell with a lot more dangerous enemies, I did not want a misclick to be able to cost me my entire run. And since I knew that a respec was coming, I also didn't want to craft anything more in Act 5, since my character's needs might change with a different build, and my new mercenary and my big new hammer was more than enough to finish up the rest of Nightmare. Before long I defeated Bale in Nightmare and I was ready to tackle the ultimate challenge for my DIY Barbarian. Though I really had been skipping a lot at the tail end of Nightmare, I entered Hell at a very modest level of 55, and that's just way too low for a melee character or any character that needs to hit their enemies at all. But here I was. Enemies were tankier and harder to hit, but they also dealt so much more damage to me now, not to mention the issue of physical resistant enemies. I struggled my way through the first quest to unlock my last remaining respec, which took a really long time to do, especially Corpse Fire was immune to both physical and cold damage. This prompted me to temporarily hire a rogue mercenary for her fire arrows to deal any damage to Corpse Fire at all. But with some patience it was eventually done and I was now facing an important decision, the final and definitive respec for this Barbarian. I have only mentioned it briefly in this video, but during the live streaming of this I talked about going for a shield so many times throughout the challenge. I was convinced that a shield for blocking was my key to surviving Hell, but then when it was finally time I had other ideas in mind. I'm not exactly sure where this idea came from originally, but I was now fixated on speccing into double throw. Having a ranged attack seemed so much safer for hardcore, and I also wanted to give the build a try because I had never really played one before. I was severely underestimating just how trash a random mediocre throwing weapon would be compared to my current big bunker of a hammer, and going double throw I would need 2 of them, but at the time I was blissfully unaware and sealed my fate with my final respec. After respecing I had 3 jewels in my stash for 3 crafts. At least 2 of them would have to go to 2 new weapons, and then I had 1 more to work with, so not a lot of wiggle room in gearing up for a complete respec. The best available throwing weapon I could craft with at the time were hurlbats, an exceptional throwing axe. The first craft got okay ED on the guaranteed roll but no extra damage, but with some attack speed on top. The second one got mana steal and some bonus against undead in addition to the fixed rolls. 2 okay but not great crafts. But I'm going to be crafting a lot more axes before this challenge is over, so I'm not gonna spend too long on these. With 2 throwing weapons in hand I finished my respec. Double throw was a given skill to max out, as was throwing mastery. And I want to highlight that in addition to extra damage, crit chance and attack rating like all the masteries, throwing mastery these days also has some great bonus stats to mitigate the big problem of quantity with throwing weapons. A chance to not consume an axe from your stack when thrown, and a chance to replenish your stack when you crit. And this is really a deal breaker for playing this character, because without something like this I would have to go to town and repair my weapon so often that it would be borderline unplayable. And then I still invested in natural resistance and battle orders, because even as a ranged fighter I wanted good defenses to survive hardcore. Though being only level 55, I didn't have many spare skill points after maxing out double throw and throwing mastery. Was this respec the right call? Well, I was optimistic, but my live chat did not share my enthusiasm, claiming I was more likely throwing the run than axes with this respec. And at first it did look pretty freaking bad. I tried my new build out against a pair of hell zombies, and that damage was really subpar. Honestly, good call by the disbelievers. But I'd like to think that I have a decent amount of experience with playing through hell with underpowered characters at this point, and I am pretty sure that I wouldn't have been looking like a rockstar with any melee spec either with my current level and gear. A big two-hander would certainly have been dealing a lot more damage, but would also have made me a lot more vulnerable. And at this point I was super invested in this character and really wanted to finish hell in hardcore to make him my first D2R guardian, and there was no denying that a ranged character with over 1200 life was looking pretty safe. But at level 55 I wasn't ready to give hell a proper try yet, bad respec or not. There really was no excuse for being such a low level, but for a barbarian the consequences would be huge, so I first went back and farmed some much needed experience in Nightmare as well as some more crafting materials. Oh, and I was also using another skill, Grim Ward. It creates a totem from a corpse which causes enemies to run away and take extra damage. I picked this skill mainly for the extra damage, but it would later turn out to be mostly a crowd control skill for me. I went back to hell at level 63, which in hindsight was still too low, but I guess I was getting restless and wanted to push on, because once I hit Act 2 I would be able to buy some really good magic throwing axes for crafting from vendors. And because of those new axes and the fact that a higher level would mean better crafts on average, I didn't craft anything new during this and instead piled up materials in my stash. Getting 2 Andariel in hell was actually not too bad. My damage and chance to hit was at least decent against regular enemies, and between ranged attacks, leap and 1400 life it was rather safe. But while half of that statement was true against Andariel as well, I was rather safe. My damage against her was just awful, with every axe barely tickling her health bar if it hit at all. Fast forward 14.5 minutes of kiting her around the pit in the floor. Yes, that is the real time it took to take her down. I did defeat her, but considering how weak I felt during this, my victory didn't taste very sweet. Seeing how much I struggled against her, my crafting materials were now burning a hole in my pocket, and once I got to Act 2 it was time for another round of crafting, and with a lot of saved up materials I went on my biggest crafting spree yet. And this was the axe I was talking about earlier. In Act 2 I could buy winged axes from vendors. A really good elite level weapon. Well, at least as far as throwing axes go. And with so many supplies saved up, I was really hoping for some impactful upgrades. Actually, I was even expecting them. The base damage of these axes were higher than my current weapons, but still not that high in the grand scheme of things, so getting some extra damage on top of the guaranteed ED was going to be the key to get a really good weapon. The first craft didn't get that, but it did get +2 to barbarian skills and some elemental damage. Not amazing, but pretty solid. And of course a big upgrade from my previous crafts using only the exceptional level base. And the same could be said about my next craft as well. +2 to masteries was very nice utility, boosting my natural resistance and my throwing mastery, though the ED roll left a bit to be desired. I would actually say that both of these axes were above average from what I could expect from a random craft, but not anything to get me super excited. Though I deemed them good enough for the time being though, to be able to spend some of the materials on upgrading a few of the other gear slots. Because let's be real here, some of this gear that I was still wearing in Act 2 of Hell were barely good enough for normal, and while my weapons were without a doubt my most important pieces of gear, I decided to try for a few armor pieces, and I would be absolutely shocked if I would not be able to make some meaningful upgrades from these. So I went for a belt next, and specifically a blood belt for the guaranteed chance to cause open wounds, which when triggered deals damage to an enemy over time and completely stops their life regen for 8 seconds. No amazing random stats, but overall pretty solid for a belt, and a big upgrade over my first one. Then to save some of my rubies for other blood crafts, I decided to make a pair of safety boots next. Not the best guaranteed stats, but damage reduction always helps. This turned out pretty mediocre still, but for sure better than the first pair, and an upgrade is an upgrade. Then a helm craft next, and I was really looking forward to getting rid of my current mask. Not only am I not the biggest fan of the look, but the stats were just laughable, and I had been wearing this for so long now. And this safety crown turned out decent. A little low rolls on the resistances, but some useful defensive stats for sure. Burning through my crafting supplies at a rapid pace, and armor craft was next. Mine was still pretty good and it would be hard to replace, but as my mercenary was still completely without a body armor, it would be put to good use even if I didn't end up using it. And this ended up being a perfectly decent body armor for my mercenary, Frost Nova when hit and some okay defensive stats. And as a bonus achievement, this marked the first time that both me and my mercenary were fully equipped. With all those craft I still had 3 jewels remaining, still with lots of room for improvement, and I decided for another pair of boots, hoping mainly for some run speed which would help a lot in kiting enemies around, and then another pair of throwing weapons. Despite running a little low on rubies, I decided for a pair of blood boots after all, and I finally got what I was looking for. 20% isn't the highest run speed you can get, but it would surely be noticeable for my character, and then the ever so useful blood stats on top. And wearing as many blood items as I did, my lifesteal was really starting to add up to a significant amount, even if the stat was low on each individual item. Then for my final 2 jewels, as well as my final 2 rubies, I prayed for some big damage throwing axes. Again, the first one got some bonus damage to demons, which would help against act bosses, which I was really struggling against, but I didn't think it was really worth it over the utility of +2 skills from my current ones. And the second one was also a miss, getting only some small, non-impactful bonuses over the guaranteed rolls. In hindsight, I should probably have crafted more axes instead of a bunch of armor, but I'll get back to that a little later. Though it is kind of funny, because I remember my own excitement from this crafting session, feeling like I scored some really decent gear, and while it is true that they were upgrades compared to what I was wearing before, looking at them now after the fact while editing this video, I must have been struggling really hard during this if I got excited by items like these. Filled with optimism, I ran out into the desert to try my new gear out. Ouch. All that crafting, elite level throwing weapons, and I was still dealing so little damage to normal trash monsters. My expectations weren't that high to begin with, but this was just really underwhelming. Averaging less than 400 damage per attack is not where you want to be in hell. Actually, way less than that if we consider that I was missing a lot of those axes too. I'm no stranger to slowly grinding through hell, so I pushed on for a while, and to give my Barbarian some credit, his survivability was really good even with its lackluster gear, which is the #1 concern in hardcore after all. I pushed on through the main quest, but I didn't even reach the end of the act before deciding that I needed to craft more weapons. I could definitely have kept grinding for a while longer in this setup, but if I was struggling so hard in Act 2, I did not feel confident at all in going into the later acts of hell, so I might as well do it sooner rather than later. So, back to farming crafting supplies in Nightmare, once again. Back in hell again after an extended grinding session, I was level 72 when I returned, and that is more of a proper level for taking on hell in my opinion, at least on a character that needs to attack. Being a higher level meant that more axes would hit, which would lead to more damage as well. I returned with a pile of 6 rubies and 2 emeralds for weapon crafts, going for more axes and also a couple of javelins, though the javelin crafts were much more of a gamble due to the previously mentioned lack of guaranteed enhanced damage. It was mostly a way of making use of all of my jewels since I didn't have enough rubies to only make blood crafts. For the video, I have really condensed a lot of the grinding in this challenge, but in reality, I had spent so much time farming for levels and materials since entering hell. I was really banking on getting some actually good weapons from this batch. If I didn't, I wasn't sure how to continue this challenge, fearing that I would get stuck in a never-ending grind for jewels and gems. With all my resources prepared, I began what would hopefully be the last big crafting session. For the first craft, I swapped to the old graphics for better luck, chat's idea, not mine, and that seemed to be working because this was a very solid craft. At first glance it didn't get the extra ED I was hoping for, but it did get another great stat, the Fool's Mod. That grants maximum damage and attack rating per level, and it really adds a lot of it too. 36 max damage and almost 1200 attack rating at my current level, and that is 1200 before any boosts from my skills or passives. I didn't fully realize it at first, but this was actually such a huge weapon for me, because despite catching up on levels and investing a lot of stats into dexterity, my chance to hit enemies was still mediocre, and this was gonna help with that in a big way. The second craft had decent utility stats, but way too low damage. The lightning damage was kind of interesting as I was struggling against physical immune enemies, but the base damage was just not good enough. And then the third axe was a complete dud. Dual leech, but just too low damage and no other interesting stats. Then I decided to do one of the javelin crafts, and being both desperate and superstitious, I went with the old graphics again. But this immediately reminded me why I favored other crafting recipes for weapons, because despite some good stats, most notably 40 attack speed, the complete lack of enhanced damage kind of killed it. This would really have been such a good weapon even with a mediocre ED roll. Axe number 4 was another brick, and at this point I was getting a little worried that I would walk away from this crafting bonanza with just one upgrade, which in hindsight wouldn't be anything out of the ordinary since we're talking about randomly generated Diablo 2 items after all, but I was still of course hoping for more. But I worried for nothing, because on the 5th craft it finally happened. A winged axe with a double ED roll, and this was really such a solid craft with a decent chunk of attack rating and some lightning damage on top too. By far the most damaging throwing weapon I had crafted yet. The first craft was still probably the best crafted weapon all things considered, but this was a really close second. My last crafted axe also got double ED, attack rating and lightning damage. Very similar to the previous one, but with lower stats overall. I was very happy and relieved, 2 actually good throwing axes, or well, better than anything else I had seen so far anyway. I just want to mention that it would be possible to craft a really cool axe with hundreds of enhanced damage, attack speed and attack rating all in one weapon, but something like that was just way too unlikely that I couldn't count on ever getting that during a challenge like this. And to me, this is what's so fun about doing challenge runs, because feeling genuine excitement over weapons like these kind of feels like playing the game again for the first time as a kid. These axes were truly a big upgrade for this character, but before I show you some fighting footage, I ask you to remember what kind of character we're dealing with here and how it was looking before. Power overwhelming. Well, okay, this still doesn't look very impressive compared to most characters, but trust me when I say that when playing it, the difference in damage and in reliability with hitting enemies more often, it was like night and day. This was the closest to a breakthrough moment that this character was going to have in Hell. And with that I was back to making progress through Hell, steadily taking down monsters who stood in my way while completing the quests of Act 2. Although I had some lightning damage now, physical immune enemies were still an absolute pain to fight, so I still resorted to Super Mario tactics whenever I encountered a bunch of those. This is a really long and grindy video, so if you're still watching, comment your favorite Mario character, and don't you dare say Yoshi. I had been crafting so many items for me lately, but my poor mercenary hadn't gotten a new weapon in forever. I was on the lookout for a magic elite level spear, but I hadn't had any luck with that so far. But I did find a plain man catcher, and during this challenge I was reading Horadric cube recipes online every day, so I had a little trick in mind. Using the Horadric cube I could add sockets to the plain spear, and using a socketed spear and 3 normal gems I could create a magical socketed spear, and that magical spear was primed for crafting. It got a very low ED roll, but with good base damage and attack speed, it turned into a decent mercenary weapon regardless. But most of all, this was a fun little trick to do. I guess I didn't mention this before, but when I got my new axes with big attack rating, I swapped my Blessed Day Mercenary for one with the Might Aura to boost my physical damage, converting some of my big attack rating bonus into damage, while still retaining a very good chance to hit. And after the upgrades, Act 2 had been pretty manageable so far, but then I found myself before Duriel, with the memory of how much harder Andariel was compared to the other enemies in Act 1 still fresh in mind. But this boss fight was looking so much better. Not only was I able to keep my mercenary alive for the most part, but my axes were actually doing decent damage to him. It was still a very grindy fight, but for this character it was as smooth as I could have asked for, and in contrast to the almost 15 minutes it took to take Andariel down, Duriel fell in less than 3 minutes total, and that felt great. This was a major victory in my eyes, being able to take down an Act boss so reliably, and after having some serious doubts for my Barbarian's chances at the start of the difficulty, now I was starting to actually believe that I could make it all the way through. The hardest parts of the game were still ahead of me, but my character was also stronger now than ever before, so when I continued into Act 3 I did so with high morale and boosted confidence. Slowly, but rather smoothly, I made my way through the jungle. I went straight for the quest items and minimized optional areas, but I could defeat any enemy that I encountered, though I ran into a fair amount of exploding dolls as well, and fighting those felt like too much risk for little to no reward, so there was a bit of leaping past enemies as well. My mercenary was doing a lot of work on the front lines, keeping our enemies busy while I buried them in axes, but towards the end of Act 3 he started to struggle a bit. After my respec I had forgotten, or maybe gotten a bit lazy about, my war cries, but even as a ranged character I could still make good use out of Taunt to fight fewer enemies at once, as well as Howl to take some heat off my mercenary. Act 3 was the quickest act in Hell so far, and I took on Mephisto at level 74. My max damage now broke 1k, and it was usually even higher for my mercenary's Might Aura, but he died every now and then against elite enemies and couldn't stand up to Mephisto at all, so this was my quote-unquote true damage for difficult encounters. And to save some gold on mercenary fees I cheesed Mephisto over the moat once my mercenary fell.
Maybe not.
On to Act 4, and now I had my eyes fixated on beating the Act bosses and finishing this challenge, but I did craft a sweet helm on my way to Diablo, a bloodcraft with +2 to Barbarian skills and some minor resist, in addition to good rolls on the blood stats. A pretty great looking helm, and I was doubting I would get any better, so I went to Larsec in Nightmare to add a socket to the helm, and put an attack speed jewel into it. A very cool helm for this challenge. I mean, this actually looks like a helm that someone would wear. I entered the Chaos Sanctuary for hopefully the last time, at level 75, and here you can see my damage when boosted by the Might Aura. It was starting to look like decent numbers. And now I had reached a familiar situation for my challenges, the delicate balance between getting absolutely destroyed if I got swarmed by too many enemies at once, but being able to handle any situation if approached carefully with some tactics, i.e. not fighting too many enemies at once. When facing Diablo for the final time, my unconventional build of a tanky ranged character came in really clutch. His fire spells could barely put a dent in my life total, with the only real danger being, as usual, his lightning attack. But by standing half a screen away from him, it was no problem to dodge, and even if I got grazed by it before I was able to move out of the way, the damage I took was completely fine. Diablo tried its best to counter my strategy by putting me in a bone prison, and that would have been an absolute death sentence if it weren't for the fact that I could just leap out of it. How that works, I do not know, and I do not question. I just appreciate the get out of jail freebie. Diablo is tanky, and I had to spend a decent amount of time running away from his spells and not attacking, so the fight took a little while. But from my point of view, this was a decisive victory. Towards the end of the fight, I was feeling so confident that when a chatter challenged me to unequip my body armor, I threw half of my armor pieces on the ground. In hindsight, what was I thinking? I have no idea. I would never have forgiven myself if this was how I lost this character. But luckily it worked out this time. And with Diablo defeated, Act 5 was now all that stood between me and finishing this challenge, and more importantly, getting my first Guardian in Diablo 2 Resurrected. I was expecting the difficulty to ramp up in the last two acts, but I had just been feeling stronger and stronger. Maybe it was the extra power from a few extra levels, or maybe it was the cool helm, or maybe it was a combination of expecting a lot of problems and me getting accustomed to playing on a very low power character. Either way, I moved quickly through the battlefields and the caves. There were mainly two things that I was worried about left in the game. The Ancients, where I was worried about my mercenaries' chances to stay alive and tank for me, and then Bale's minions. And to some extent Bale himself as well, I guess, but with how tanky my Barbarian had gotten, my gut told me that if I made it to Bale, I would be able to grind him down eventually, because for him to kill me with a 2k life pool and decent resistances, I would either have to completely run out of money and potions or make some major mistake, which could of course happen, especially as I was playing this character. First off, the Ancients, and the difficulty of this fight would depend so much on the random stats they spawned with. The main things that I did not want to see was some combination of extra strong, extra fast, cursed, and a damage boosting aura like Might or Fanaticism. And I got pretty lucky. I got an extra fast Madak, and someone with the blessed aim aura, but other than that their stats seemed pretty harmless. Corlic had spawned with Stone Skin, which is physical resistance. That was of course tedious, with me mostly dealing physical damage, but I was happily taking time consuming over dangerous for this fight. And actually, here's another instance of throwing mastery, conserving and even replenishing my axes, being a complete game changer, because without that I would not have had nearly enough ammunition for this fight, and if you go back to town in the middle of the fight, you have to start it all over from scratch. After a few minutes of grinding Corlic down, we moved on to Madak. And in a duel between throw barbs, I completely dominated him. And sure, I was using potions and had some hired help, but that is besides the point. I won, and that's all that matters. And then it was all down to Talik, who turned out to have spawned with Stone Skin as well. But once again, I would rather grind through a time-consuming fight than face the risk of dying. And after just under 15 minutes from the fight starting, all three Barbarians were defeated. That was a real grind, but I was just happy that they spawned with defensive stats rather than offensive ones, because I was honestly a little scared of dying to them before the fight started. It has happened several times in previous challenges that I have felt very confident in the fight, and then out of nowhere I died to Talik whirlwinding on me, or failed to separate them and get bursted down before I knew what happened. Being a ranged Barbarian was very nice against Bale's minions, because it allowed me to stay out of Bale's curse range to avoid getting slowed by his Decrepify curse. The early waves weren't trivial by any means, but they weren't really hard either. I could wear them down steadily and retreated backwards through the entrance if needed, and combined with some tactical warcry usage, I took down one wave after the other. Lister and the Minions of Destruction was another enemy who could really cause trouble for me, if he rolled strong random stats, and he did spawn extra fast, but the rest of his stats weren't too dangerous. My Mercenary was even able to stand up to him, which really highlights Lister's poor performance. Well, okay, to be fair, I had to retreat and pull them apart to only fight Lister alone and then 1 or 2 minions at a time, as fighting them all at the same time would leave me with no chance at all. But that is not cowardly, it's tactical, and I tactically threw axes at Lister until he perished. And then there was only Bale left, and I have to say he was causing a bit more trouble for me than I anticipated. The Lord of Destruction's mana drain and cold wave attacks were big problems for my damage output, and by teleporting around and summoning his clone, it felt like Lord of Being a Nuisance was a more fitting title. But being very annoying aside, in the end, this fight played out as I foretold earlier. It was slow, it was grindy, but with over 2000 life, Bale couldn't really put me in any real danger. He did get my life down to like a quarter a few times, so kudos to Bale for trying his best. And a bit over 20 minutes later, including all trips to town etc., I threw my final axe for this challenge. Bale was defeated, and with that, the final difficulty. Diablo 2 beaten using only crafted gear. I finished the challenge at level 77, and here's a quick recap of my final gear. This was a very fun but extremely grindy challenge. Though of course a big reason for that was that I stubbornly picked the Barbarian, an extremely gear dependent character. The double throw respec worked out in the end, but I'm not sure if it was the right call after all. I might have been able to put together a stronger build using other skills, and having to craft 2 good weapons instead of 1 really put a strain on my crafting supplies. But then again, the added safety of a ranged attack was nice to have in hardcore, especially in the later parts of the challenge against nasty elite enemies. With a smile on his face, Deckard Cain presented me with the title of Guardian for beating hell difficulty in hardcore. And with a smile like that, Cain must have been thinking of all the wonderful supporters this channel has. Thank you so much to all the goblins for your continued support, and thank you for watching.